Good day. Today is Monday, 8th September 2025, and as you can see, I'm again doing this program from a different room in my house. There is again building work nearby, and I have had to relocate because of the ambient noise. Anyway, with that, let's get directly into what we're going to discuss in this program, which is the increasingly complex international situation. And of course, I will be focusing on Ukraine, though conflicts are brewing between the United States and Venezuela. And of course, in the background, there is the festering and, in my opinion, deepening crisis in the Middle East. But let's first start with Ukraine and let's look at the military situation there. Because yesterday, I said in my program that it seemed to me as if, following Vladimir Putin's various comments last week, his comments in the press conference in China and his comments at the Far East Asia Forum, that the Russians, having successfully navigated themselves past the various demands, first from their friends, the Brazilians and the Indians, and then from Donald Trump, to agree to a ceasefire of the conflict and a freeze of the conflict. The Russians, as I said, have managed to get past that. They've also solidified their friendships with their BRICS partners. They no longer fear the kind of energy cut-offs that were being threatened by the United States. India has shown that it will not respond to pressure from the United States to stop buying Russian oil, and China has agreed to step up buying of Russian energy by agreeing to the package, the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Anyway, that the Russians, having navigated around this difficult question, this proposed ceasefire, having got both their allies and friends and the Trump administration to drop the idea of a ceasefire, the Russians now are focusing on the war. They no longer are concealing their belief that a negotiation with the Zelensky government is impossible. Putin went to great lengths over the course of that press conference and his speech and a question and answer at the Far East Asia Forum to explain why. And the Russians are focusing on achieving a military victory. And they're not only focusing on achieving a military victory, they are stepping up their actions. They are intensifying the actions that they're going to take. And we saw that firstly with the attack on the bridge in Kremenchuk, the bridge across the Dnieper, and possibly with the drone that hit the government building in Kiev, and beyond any question, with the sheer scale of the drone attack which took place 2 days ago now, in which 810 Duran drones were used in total, alongside missiles that also did a significant amount of damage. Now, I want to return to this topic because we've now had further clarification, and perhaps the most important clarification is about the attack on the bridge across the Dnieper, the bridge in Kremenchuk, the first Dnieper bridge that the Russians have attacked. And we now have information that puts the issue of whether that was an intentional attack beyond any possible doubt. I say that because other targets in Kremenchuk were apparently also attacked over the course of that massive Russian drone strike. But we now learn that no fewer than 11 Duran drones struck the Kremenchuk bridge. 11. Now, if it had just been one, which did a certain amount of damage, one might have said that it was a drone that went astray, or that there was a fault, or something of that kind. But when we're talking about 11 drones striking the bridge, I don't think there's any doubt, well, there cannot be any doubt that this was a deliberate attack. The first such attack up to now on a bridge, one of the bridges across the Dnieper. Now, no one believes that 11 Geran drones, or one Geran drone, or even more of these drones, would be able to do structural damage to a bridge of this kind. These are massive Soviet-era constructions. They are built to withstand enormous damage, and the drone strikes, though it's clear that they did more damage than I realized in my video yesterday, there's now footage which shows the roadway of the bridge completely impassable, covered in debris. Nonetheless, the bridge itself still stands. But to repeat again, the Russians now have demonstrated that they can attack the bridge. 11 drones attacked the bridge. Air defenses were completely ineffective. Jamming of drones was completely ineffective. The Russians have long possessed the ability to strike and destroy these bridges, and they have weapons, Kinjal hypersonic missiles, Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, Oreshnik missiles, which are of course on a completely bigger, on a vastly bigger and more powerful scale. Fab 3000 precision guided bombs. Any one of these weapons could destroy a bridge completely. But the point is that even this attack with the 11 drones did enough damage to close the bridge for many hours. Now, I've been seeing video footage of road traffic going through a different Dnieper bridge. It's clear that the traffic was diverted to this other bridge from the bridge in Kremenchug, and what you see is massive traffic jams as there's a pile up of traffic trying to cross the bridge. I'm not sure, by the way, in which direction, whether from the east or from the west. The point is that if the Russians now want to interrupt traffic on any one of these Dnieper bridges, they can do so for several hours without destroying the bridge itself. And of course, if they're going to be producing 1,000 drones, Geran drones a day, which, by the way, to repeat, I think is well within their resources, then, in theory, if they conduct attacks on Ukraine with 1,000 drones, they can certainly attack simultaneously all or most of the Dnieper bridges. And probably they could do this day after day after day. They could block the bridges. They could render them inoperable for the Ukrainians. And that would choke off any communication across the river between East and West Ukraine. And from a Russian point of view, the attraction of doing that would be that eventually, when the Dnieper, the east bank of the Dnieper, falls under their control, if they wanted still to use the bridges to cross them, well, in theory, if the bridges were still there, they could do so. Now, of course, this is a theoretical possibility, because if we get to a situation where the Russians reach the east bank of the Dnieper, one must assume that the Ukrainians themselves would mine and blow up the bridges. But you never know. and it might be that special forces could be used to take control of the bridges or any one of those things. But it might be a way, what the Russians have done, of closing the bridges for several hours or several days, choking off movement of supplies and men and material from the west bank of the Dnieper to the east bank of the Dnieper, and doing that without destroying the bridges, if that is indeed what the Russians want to do. And this attack on the bridge in Kremenchuk looks like a test run of that very thing. Of course, that doesn't exclude the possibility that later on in the war, if the Russians do decide to destroy the bridges and leave the entire Ukrainian army, or at least the combat-ready part of the Ukrainian army, marooned across the river, well, as I said, the Russians could do it. Anyway, there we go. And I think this has been an alarming development for the Ukrainians, and it may explain certain defiant comments that President Zelensky also made over the course of an interview which he has given, which I will come to later in a moment. Now, let's continue with other information we have about this drone strike, because it turns out that as well as attacking this particular bridge in Kremenchuk and all of the various other military installations, the airfields, the places where the drones were being assembled, that the Russian Defense Ministry was saying, it looks as if the Russians also, for the first time in, well, very many months, attacked a thermal power station in Ukraine. It looks like they're about to resume the energy war. They basically stopped attacking the thermal power stations in the spring. This is the time when President Trump was trying to get both sides to agree to an energy ceasefire. It never lasted, if I can say. The Ukrainians obviously have been attacking refineries continuously, Russian refineries continuously, throughout all this period of time. But of course, the Russians can do far more damage. Their missiles and drones are far more powerful than the Ukrainian ones. And, well, the Ukrainian energy system has already been severely damaged by earlier Russian strikes. If, of course, the Russians mount an offensive, another offensive against Ukraine's energy complex this autumn, given the depleted state of Ukraine's air defense system, given the already existing damage to the power stations, it could indeed create a severe crisis for Ukraine, an energy crisis for Ukraine this winter, on top of all of the other problems that Ukraine is facing. Now, to repeat again, this was an enormous drone strike, 810 Duran drones, and some missiles used as well, though I'm not exactly sure how many. There remains an intrigue about the drone strike, if it was a drone strike, on the government building in Kiev. The Ukrainian government, Prime Minister Syrsky, continues to insist that this was a deliberate, intentional drone strike by the Ukrainian Air Force. The mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, who it is important to say is a political opponent of President Zelenskyy's and a critic of President Zelenskyy's policies, he says that it was the result of a Russian Duran drone being hit by Ukrainian air defenses, diverted from its course, and its debris falling on this building and causing damage that way. And there have been claims to that effect also by several Ukrainian social media sites. I don't know who is correct about this, but I still note the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russians themselves are saying nothing about this incident. They're not saying that it was a drone that misfired. They're not saying that they were not intending to strike this building, or that it was some kind of false flag or a misrepresentation or disinformation by the Ukrainians. They are maintaining a stony silence. We had that one sentence at the end of yesterday's Ministry of Defense, Russian Ministry of Defense report about the drone strikes, the missile and drone strikes, in which the Russian Ministry of Defense said that only designated targets were hit, no buildings that were not designated were hit. Bear in mind that the bridge that crossed the river at Kremenchuk was also obviously a designated target. But going over the Ministry of Defense report, I don't myself find any reference to it, just to say. And nor did I find any reference to this thermal power plant. So the Russians telling us that it was only designated targets that were hit doesn't exclude the government building in Kiev if it was a designated target, and it might have been. And that still inclines me to the view that this probably was an intentional Russian strike. It probably suits the agenda of Klitschko and some other people in Ukraine to pretend that this was a drone that went astray because they're critical of President Zelensky. They want to draw attention to weaknesses in the air defenses in Kiev. And I suspect, this is my guess, and I'll stress this is only a guess, what this is all about. If the Russians were not involved in the attack on the government building in Kiev, I would have expected them to say so simply. And up to now, they have not done so. Anyway, the drone strike is, to my mind, the very big event. Now, a couple of days ago, when he did his presentation, the one that I've discussed in previous programs, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces and the overall commander of the groups of forces that are conducting the special military operation, General Gerasimov, said that with the end of the spring and summer, the time had come to start setting targets and plans for the autumn campaign, the autumn season. And I wonder whether we are seeing the first indicators with this big drone strike, with the attack, the test run perhaps on the Dnieper bridge in Kremenchuk, perhaps the attack on the government building, the attack on the thermal power plant, whether we're starting to see the first indications that indeed planning is underway for the autumn campaign. There is a constant murmur of reports, both from the Ukrainian Telegram channels and blogs and things, and from the Russians, that the Russians are assembling enormous forces, specifically in the Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka area, and are preparing for some big offensive. So perhaps all of this fits together. Perhaps Gerasimov has concluded that the moment has come to start to upscale the special military operation, to start broadening the range of targets, to include the decision-making centres in Kiev, the government building, for example, to include the Dnieper bridges, to resume the attacks on the thermal power plants as part of the big autumn offensive which is coming. To repeat again, Gerasimov, the Russian General Staff, don't share their plans with me. But if Putin has indeed given the military the green light to go all out, which his various comments last week in China and at the Far Eastern Forum strongly suggest, well, what we are seeing, and Gerasimov's words, are not inconsistent with that. Anyway, since I've started on these things, I think it might be worth saying a few things about the situation on the ground, which is continuing to develop. Perhaps an area of the battlefields which I've neglected is the West Donbass, Zaporozhye direction. The Russian advance here seems to be unstoppable. It's not particularly rapid, but it moves forward remorselessly like the proverbial steamroller. Every single day, one gets reports of further Russian progress here, of more villages being taken, of more advances happening, and the Russians do indeed seem to be very, very close to this village of Veliko-Mikhailovka, a big village, and if it is indeed captured, well, that not only puts them in a position, as many have commented, to cut the supply roads going from the north to the two towns of Orekhov and Gulyapolye, but it also positions them significantly closer to the city of Zaporozhye from the east, and it also gives them what is apparently a large village, one which could be used as a kind of forward base area for further advances. So anyway, a remorseless advance in this direction, combined with a Russian pressure on Orekhov, in particular, and Gulyapolye from the south. Russian forces have been pushing towards these places. There's apparently intense fighting going on in the village of Malaya Tokmachka, which is located close to Orekhov. This battle for Malaya Tokmachka has been going on for a very long time. Again, one senses that the Ukrainians are under urgent pressure to hold on to this village, because perhaps they calculate that if it does fall, the position of Orekhov, the defense of Orekhov, becomes impossible. Anyway, that is one battle, that is one advance that is definitely taking place. It's difficult, as I said, to get the exact details, but there doesn't seem to be any doubt about this. Now, further north in Pokrovsk, a very complex battle does seem to be underway, and going off that information that I received about 2 weeks ago, it looks to me as if the Russians are indeed now treating the Battle of Pokrovsk as a second Operation Meat Grinder. The first Operation Meat Grinder was the Battle of Bakhmut in 2023. The Russians used Bakhmut as a magnet that drew the best units of the Ukrainian army, and where they were mauled and ground down in a way that weakened the Ukrainians in advance of their summer 2023 offensive. And of course, Bakhmut was indeed eventually captured by the Russians, and this significantly weakened Ukrainian defenses in northern Donetsk region. We'll come to all of that in a moment. Well, it seems to me that the Russians are doing the same, roughly the same thing in Pokrovsk. Now, there is a big shortage of information from Pokrovsk. I say a big shortage of information. General Syrsky has been claiming that the Ukrainians have made enormous advances. They've recaptured 25 square kilometers of territory. He hasn't provided a scintilla of evidence to confirm this. The Ukrainians have transferred large areas of territory that the Russians controlled. At least deep state, the Ukrainian mapping project has large areas that the Russians formerly controlled or captured to the grey zone from the Russian-controlled area. The Russians deny that all of these Ukrainian advances have in fact happened. Neither side is producing much in the way of video footage. Given that it is the Ukrainians who are counterattacking, and given how much importance has been attributed by the Ukrainians to the defense of Pokrovsk, and correctly so, in my opinion, the lack of video footage, in my opinion, suggests that these Ukrainian counterattacks are proving to be unsuccessful. That is what Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, has been saying, and I have every reason to think that is correct. According to Radovka and other sources within the city of Pokrovsk itself, the Russian advances continue. I expect we will have a lot more clarification about what exactly is taking place in the Pokrovsk area within the next 24 hours. Anyway, we'll see. So anyway, intense fighting in Pokrovsk, that the Ukrainians are suffering very heavy losses in this area is indisputable. I said that there was a dearth of drone footage, but there is significant drone footage appearing from the supply roads in the area, north and west of Pokrovsk, and we see the roads littered with the burnt out wreckage of Ukrainian vehicles, supply vehicles, which are now regularly attacked by the Russian drones and by the Russian artillery, and I suspect by the Russian raiding parties that are apparently also roaming the countryside in this area. Anyway, elsewhere, in the northeastern area of the Donbass battlefields, the evidence points not just to a continued Russian advance, but to a rapid Russian advance. Just as there's been a dearth of reports about what's happening in the Pokrovsk area, information about the situation in Kupiansk has stopped being provided. And the rumors are that the Russians now control at least 50% of Kupiansk, perhaps more of it, and that Kupiansk itself is about to fall, and that within Kupiansk, even the Ukrainians admit that all of the main supply roads are cut, and that it looks as if the Ukrainian garrison of Kupiansk is encircled and is being forced into a position of either flight through Russian-controlled territory, which would destroy the units involved, or surrender, which of course they've been ordered by Zelensky and Syrsky not to do. If this is correct, and every indication, including the latest video footage that I saw from Kupiansk, every indication appears to bear this out, then a disaster is developing for the Ukrainians in the Kupiansk area. And, well, we have received many more reports now from the Liman-Siversk area, including an admission from Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, that the Russians have indeed captured certain built-up areas immediately to the north of Siversk, which apparently fall within the Syrsky metropolitan area. Something which, by the way, confirms Gerasimov's claim made a couple of days ago that fighting is already taking place within the city boundaries of Syrsky. Now, this is an isolated, built-up area. I am not absolutely clear what it is, whether it is a dacha settlement or a residential area or some kind of micro-district, or whether it might be some kind of small industrial area. It seems that the Russians have not yet achieved complete control of this territory, but fighting is taking place on it. And there are lots of reports that appear now to confirm conclusively that the Russians remain in control of Serebyanka, the village which Andrei Marochko, the Russian commentator, suggested yesterday, implied yesterday, that the Russians are retreating from, are withdrawing from. I suspect that there was a misunderstanding or perhaps a mistranslation, and what Marochko perhaps intended to convey was that the Russians were advancing southward from Serebyanka, because there's been a lot more information, including from Ukrainian channels, which appear to confirm the Russian advance towards Yampol and perhaps the battle taking place there. This is a village that lies between Liman and Syrsky, the capture of which would cut off the supply lines to Syrsky, the supply roads to Syrsky, and also Russian advances south of the Serebyanka forest towards the Syrsky Donetsk river, a river that has been long fought over, by the way. It seems that the Russians have almost reached its northern bank, and of course if they cross the river, then of course the battle for Syrsky will be well and truly joined. Now, here, by the way, just to go back to an event that took place in the spring and it was the early summer of 2022. The Russians at that time controlled all of these forested areas north of Syrsky. They controlled the Serebyanka forest and the Kremenaya forest that is to the west, and they reached the northern bank of the Syrsky Donetsk river, and an armoured unit, a Russian armoured unit, tried to cross to the south bank. And this armoured unit was then shelled by Ukrainian artillery, apparently located in Syrsky itself. It was apparently this movement of armour, Russian armour, across the Syrsky Donetsk river was spotted by Ukrainian drones, or at any rate the Ukrainians were given information about this movement. Maybe it was spotted by American satellites, who knows. But anyway, the Russians did lose quite a lot of armour in this battle, though there was an inflation, as one might expect, in the Western media about the exact damage that was done. There were claims that an entire Russian battalion had been destroyed. I pointed out at the time that this definitely overstated the damage that was actually done. Well, the Russians are now very close again to returning to this river. The attempted attack across the Syrsky Donetsk River in 2022 was clearly aimed at advancing on Syrsky itself. The Russians had just captured Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and it looked as if they were thinking at the time of capturing Syrsky. This was the first attempt to move on Syrsky. It failed. Then in the autumn of 2022, the Ukrainians recaptured all of this territory as the result of their counteroffensive, their Kharkov counteroffensive, The Russians have now recaptured the forests. They are moving south towards the river. This time, it seems there is no significant artillery left in Syrsky. The Russians control the sky. The Ukrainians would not be able to use drones in the same way as they did in 2022 or at later stages of the war. If the Russians choose to force the Syrsky Donetsk River this time and move on Syrsky from the north, I have absolutely no doubt that they will have little difficulty doing so. So anyway, that is the change here. Some people are talking about a collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the Syrsky Liman area. The Russians have also, by the way, got much closer to Liman as well. Maybe that overstates things. But if it's not yet a collapse, we are heading clearly in that direction. And clearly there is a collapse of the situation in Kupiansk, which appears to be underway. And I wonder what the Ukrainians will say when Kupiansk does indeed fall. Now, there's also reports that in Sumy region, the Russians have finally captured the village of Yunakovka in Sumy region. This was the major fortified village that the Ukrainians fell back to in Sumy region after the Russians drove them out of Russia's own Kursk region. But of course I can't speak about that because I've not seen any video confirmation and the Russian Defense Ministry has not confirmed it, nor to my knowledge has Group of Forces North. If Yunakovka has indeed fallen, it will, in my opinion, simplify Russian operations in Sumy region, and we might start to see a resumption of the Russian offensive towards the city of Sumy as well. And there are many reports of further Russian advances in the area of Volchansk in Kharkiv region, but I'm not going to discuss those in this program. So we could see that the pressure on the front lines is increasing all the time. Now, the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Syrsky, has now come out and said that the Russians, along the line of contact, outnumber the Ukrainians 3-1, and in some parts of the battlefronts, they outnumber the Ukrainians 6-1. Now, let's just take a step back and assume that what Syrsky is telling us here is true. In that case, given that Syrsky tells us that the Russian forces in Ukraine on the battlefields number around 650,000 men, then the total Ukrainian forces on the line of contact now number around 200,000. Now, I've seen that number suggested before. Bear in mind that 200,000 men does not mean 200,000 infantry able to conduct fighting on the line of contact. Some weeks ago, I remember one Ukrainian commentator say that the Ukrainians were down to roughly 30,000 men in their infantry, and that this was creating lots of gaps on the front lines through which the Russians could infiltrate. Now, that highlights the importance of this fortified line of towns: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk. Because if the Ukrainians lose these towns, if the Russians are able to break through them, if this line of defense, the main remaining line of defense, is broken, then the Ukrainians don't have enough men to stop the Russians in open country. And if the Russians at that point start to bring armour into play, tank and armoured columns, the Ukrainians no longer have the infantry to hold them back. So one can see why the Ukrainians are throwing everything they have left to trying to hold their positions in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk, why they're trying these desperate counterattacks in Pokrovsk itself. And from a Russian perspective, we can see why it works to the Russian advantage now to resume a kind of Operation Meat Grinder 2 in the Pokrovsk area. Because if the Russians are dealing with a Ukrainian army as depleted as Syrsky's comments suggest it is, and as Putin's recent comments also said it was, then of course the losses the Ukrainians are suffering, trying to cling on to positions around Pokrovsk, are losses that they cannot afford and which they will bear a huge price for when Pokrovsk is eventually lost and this line of cities falls. And that perhaps brings us to Zelenskyy's latest interview, because he's given an interview to US television. He said, I thought, a very remarkable thing. He said that if Ukraine is not fully conquered by the Russians, then it is winning the war. And that, in a strange way, coming from Zelensky, is the most pessimistic and downbeat thing he has said pretty much since the start of the special military operation. Because, in effect, it is an admission that the Russians have the initiative. If the Russians, if the measure of Ukraine's success is no longer Ukraine's ability to hold back the Russians in Donbass or to recapture lost territory, but merely to survive, then, well, that is significantly less than the kind of victory that Zelensky himself was talking about earlier in the war, which is a victory to recapture Russian territory, to force the Russians to pay reparations, to agree to war crimes trials, to do all of those things that Zelensky's peace plan, the peace plan he outlined, to my recollection, the best of my recollection, in the autumn of 2022, and which he was clinging to right up until the autumn of 2024, and which up to now he has never fully dropped. Anyway, it looks as if even in Zelensky's mind, that peace plan, so-called peace plan, actually victory plan, is now dead. I have to say that what Zelensky says one day, he's likely to change completely the next day. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, over the course of a program that we did together, suggested that, in fact, if Zelensky now admits that for Ukraine, victory is simply survival, well, in that case, he can seal his victory logically by simply agreeing to the Russian demands, which fall well short of Ukraine's capitulation. Istanbul Plus, after all, appears to envisage a continued survival for Ukraine, at least in some form. But of course, Zelensky is not going to do that. And no one, for the moment, in the West is talking about it. So anyway, I did say some months ago that the Ukrainians, it seemed to me, at some point in the war, had come to understand that it looked increasingly likely that the war would be lost, that the penny had dropped, that all of the promises of Western aid would never be able to change the realities on the battlefronts. Zelensky's rather downbeat comments during the Coalition of the Willing meeting on Thursday in Paris, the one that was co-hosted by Starmer and Macron, saying that all that he was hearing sounded very theoretical and didn't seem to be practical in terms of Ukraine's actual needs. Anyway, that seems to bear it out. One gets the sense that Zelensky increasingly is indeed preparing for the end. But as I discussed in previous programs, my own view is that that doesn't mean that he intends to negotiate at all. His priority now is to retain control of Ukraine until the very end and then quit, in effect, whilst he's still ahead, perhaps going to the West, setting up an exile government there, do something of that kind. Anyway, there we go. Now, lots of discussions continue in the West, but what I have described up to now is the reality. The reality of a continued Russian advance, of a Russian belief that they have sorted out the diplomacy, that they have consolidated the backing of their friends, and that they're able to focus now on the war. A reality which I sense even Zelensky recognizes. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, over the last couple of hours, has given an interview in which he reinforces all of these points. It seemed to me to have something of the quality, not exactly of a victory interview, but one in which he conveyed the impression that he now believes that victory from this point, if not an absolute certainty, is now an overwhelmingly likely probability. He talked about the fact, for example, that the Russians would not seek revenge against the West. He said that this isn't what the Russians are all about, that they are frustrated that the West continues to show the extreme hostility that it does. He said that there are still fringe characters in the West. I don't believe they're fringe characters, by the way. That fringe characters in the West who still dream of breaking up and disintegrating Russia, and presumably of engineering a regime change there. But he said that these people were being marginalized. He said that in their discussions with the Americans, with the Trump administration, with Donald Trump himself, the Russians have increasingly come round to thinking that the Americans have come to understand and accept many of the realities, that Project Ukraine is played out, that it is not going to succeed, that the Russians have legitimate concerns based on security and on the treatment of their people in Ukraine and on the root causes. So when, in my experience, someone talks about no longer needing to think about and talk about revenge, the person who tends to do that is the person who believes they've won or they are going to win. It is the losers who dwell on ideas of revenge, the losers in a conflict, who dwell on the ideas of revenge, not the winners. Just saying. So anyway, that's the Russians. What about the other side? Well, I had understood that last week that today there would be a meeting between the Americans and the Europeans to discuss further sanctions and security guarantees and American troop deployments and all of that to Ukraine. There's no word of such a meeting actually taking place, but Donald Trump says that some European officials are indeed coming to Washington in order to talk to the Americans about these matters. But Trump suggested that these people might come either today, that is to say Monday, or tomorrow. It all seems rather vague. He was asked whether the United States might indeed move forward to imposing sanctions on the Russians, and Trump, as he always does, appeared to say yes, did say yes, but again, he seemed to say this without giving the impression of having much conviction. He said also that he wanted to speak to Putin, and this is, of course, the endless game that Trump plays. He says to the world that he's going to impose all kinds of deadlines on the Russians, 50-day deadlines, 8th of August deadlines, and then he has a discussion with Putin, and he comes back and he says huge progress is being made, and we're moving closer and closer towards peace, and that buys more time, and all of those things. And, well, the deadlines pass, things basically remain as they were, and the sanctions that Trump threatens never quite materialize, and instead there is another meeting or discussion with Putin, and the can is kicked further down the road. Now, the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has also given an interview in which he has suggested that some kind of draconian sanctions against the Russians, or rather their trading partners, might be underway, but he says that the Americans are trying to coordinate this with the Europeans. The Americans want the Europeans to commit to stopping all imports of Russian oil and gas and all of that. Very complicated to see how the Europeans can do that without seeing energy costs in Europe spike. The head of the Russian gas export monopoly, Gazprom, Mr. Miller, has come forward and said that Europe is facing a potentially very difficult energy situation this winter, especially if the winter is a cold one. And I suspect that he is right, and that he's very well informed about the situation. Just saying. I've received a very interesting email over the last 24 hours, which is talking about the energy situation in Europe, but also the energy situation relative to Venezuela. Now, as I've discussed in previous programs, this enormous military deployment by the United States of warships in Venezuela and amphibious warfare ships off the coast of Venezuela, and this belligerent rhetoric about how the Venezuelan government is really a drugs cartel and an organized crime group which needs to be destroyed, and the attack on speedboats in the seas close to Venezuela, which quite could, for all I know, quite possibly have been smuggling drugs. But I share the alarm and concern and horror of many people, Senator Rand Paul, Larry Johnson, on Sonar 21, that the attack on this speedboat was absolutely illegal and wrong. At the very least, the Americans could have acted to empower this boat and to arrest the people on it and to find out what indeed it was indeed carrying, if it was indeed carrying anything. But anyway, all of this, it seems to me, is preparatory and, by the way, conditioning to prepare us for some kind of attack on Venezuela itself. And to be clear, what I expect is a decapitation strike, similar to what the Israelis have been doing in the Middle East. Attacks on Hezbollah, attacks on Iran, an attempted decapitation strike of the Iranian leadership. This is what took place during the Israeli attacks on Iran in June. I fully expect that there will be an attempted decapitation strike on the Venezuelan leadership. There are insufficient infantry to invade Venezuela. I think instead that there will be attempts to conduct strikes and air attacks to kill Venezuelan leaders, probably President Maduro himself, the top military leaders, other members of the civilian government. And the expectation is that this will provoke an internal crisis in Venezuela and that it will bring people favorable to the United States into power in Venezuela. The recent announcements from the Trump administration that they're prepared to shoot down Venezuelan fighter jets, F-16 fighter jets, which the Americans say have been buzzing their warships, and the deployment of F-35 fifth generation stealth fighter jets to the area, all point in that direction. I have no doubt about this. But anyway, one of the objectives, unquestionably, is to gain control of Venezuela's oil. And I can imagine that at some level, some people in the United States, perhaps in Europe, are saying to themselves, let's not worry, let's just go ahead, let's impose all these tariffs and sanctions. If there's a crisis in the energy markets, we don't need to worry because we're going to have Venezuelan oil on tap very soon, and it will be circulating around the world, and most of it will be going to Europe and to the United States, and will be covered that way. And this email that I've got suggests that probably there is someone already that the Americans are in contact with in Venezuela who is the Americans expect to take over. And this person, whoever he or she is, has apparently already made commitments, private commitments, that American oil companies and European oil companies will be able to take over control of Venezuelan oil. In fact, according to this source, who I should say is getting this information from information that is circling inside the Russian parliament, there's already been meetings between the Americans and the Europeans in which, based on the assurances provided by this person within Venezuela. There's already been agreements basically to carve up Venezuelan oil between the Americans and the Europeans. Well, it could be that all of this is indeed in preparation and is going to happen. But just to repeat, just to say, even if this entire Venezuelan operation goes according to plan, which of course it might not, it still wouldn't cover Europe and the United States for their energy needs this winter, because Venezuelan oil, the oil industry there is apparently in poor shape. It will take some years probably to get production up to a full level. Venezuelan oil is very heavy. It's been described to me as similar to tar. There are American refineries that are capable of refining Venezuelan oil, but this will take time to sort out, all the arrangements to sort out. And personally, I don't expect Venezuelan oil to make a major difference to the energy mix in the West for perhaps a year, maybe even two. Even if, as I said, this operation, this, by the way, just to make it absolutely clear, appalling operation that is being planned actually succeeds in the way that people apparently expect it to. But anyway, the point is, the Europeans, the Americans, going to come together. They're going to talk about sanctions against Russia today or tomorrow. Scott Bessent is talking about energy sanctions against the Russians again. But according to Gideon Rachman, the extremely well-informed journalist, commentator on the Financial Times, the sanctions that are being discussed appear to fall short of what the Europeans and perhaps Lindsey Graham and company expect. Because apparently it seems that when this topic was last discussed by the Europeans and the Americans, over the course of the telephone conversation between Trump and the Europeans, which took place on Thursday after the Coalition of the Willing meeting, the Europeans found Trump confrontational and aggressive and apparently profane. That's the first time we've heard that. Apparently he engaged in profanities, which, according to Gideon Rachman, the Europeans are used to. I doubt that they really are. But it seems that the plan is no longer to impose the 100 and 500% tariffs on China and India and all of the others. It's basically to try to increase pressure specifically on China by trying to, focus on goods that help the Russian war effort. In other words, supplies, technical things of that kind, trying to increase sanctions pressure on China, but falling well short of the kind of massive tariffs and sanctions that we are talking about. It's not an entirely clear article. Gideon Rachman's article is not entirely clear, but that was certainly the impression I got. In other words, the Americans stopping well short of launching an all-out economic war against China, of the kind that they attempted in the spring, which of course ended disastrously for them. Now, here I ought to say that the Chinese have taken further steps which on the contrary strongly suggest that they are intensifying the steps that they're taking to strengthen their economic links with the Russians. The Chinese have apparently lifted the restrictions on at least some Russian companies who want to borrow on China's enormously liquid financial markets. So that Russian companies, Rosatom being one that's been specifically mentioned, would now be able to float bonds, RMB bonds, on Chinese markets. And this follows the fact that the RMB is now apparently fairly widely used inside Russia. And of course, floating those kind of bonds would facilitate the business of Russian companies like Rosatom and others in the Chinese market. I am going to suggest that over the course of the last 3 years, since February 2022, the Russians and the Chinese have worked out various workarounds on the American sanctions, the American and European sanctions. They've created structures to facilitate trade between them, and they've ensured that those structures are essentially sanction proof. So banks have probably been set up to enable funding and financing to move backwards and forwards between China and Russia. We've seen that energy companies probably have done the same. That's how the Power of Siberia pipeline is going to function. Probably industrial supply chains have also been created within China, which are insulated from Western sanctions because they will not be doing business with Western customers. And at least some Chinese markets, perhaps special Chinese markets, are being created, special banking systems are being created to enable the Chinese and the Russians to trade with each other and for Russian companies to float or to float bonds in Chinese financial markets. And of course the Chinese and the Russians have now agreed to full visa-free travel between their countries. And that implies that, again, systems have been created to enable Russian travelers traveling to China to use their Mir cards and Chinese travelers to Russia to use their Union Pay cards. And not just the cards, but all the systems that the Chinese, by the way, pioneered using QR codes and those kind of things. They're probably operating as well. So I suspect, in fact, I am confident that the Americans, who must at some level at least know all about this, that their approach to these sanctions ideas, are half-hearted. They don't want to go back to the ideas of imposing 100% tariffs on China, certainly. They know what the effect of that would be. China would withhold rare earths. Supply chains would start to freeze up. There would be a major industrial decline in the United States, across the entire Western economies. There would be a crisis. The idea that tariffs and sanctions would not impact on energy markets because a flood of Venezuelan oil is suddenly going to materialize is frankly wrong. I think that Miller is right. In fact, on the contrary, we're more likely to see energy prices rise again in the winter, irrespective of what the Western powers do on the sanctions front. But despite all of that, the Western powers can't let it go. They still have to talk about all of these things, about sanctions and tariffs and all of those kind of things, and about troop deployments in Ukraine. And despite all of these ideas circulating, you get the sense that Trump himself is now almost at the point of giving up. I mentioned Gideon Rachman's article. He clearly has basically almost given up himself. Look at the words with which he ends his article. The clear danger for the Europeans is that they're so immersed in the intricacies of diplomacy and the fine art of Trump whispering that they are missing the big picture. The US president has repeatedly signalled by word and deed that he does not want to commit to the defence of Ukraine. The newly renamed Department of War is reportedly soon to announce that America will concentrate on defending its own interests in the Western Hemisphere. Getting Trump to increase military and economic pressure on Putin and to stick with it would be an incredible feat of persuasion. It is certainly worth a try, but Europe needs a plan B for when the Trump whispering fails. So he says, give it a go, but it's not going to work. We are not going to get the American security guarantees. We are not going to get the backstop for European forces or NATO forces in Ukraine. Putin is not interested in a ceasefire, and Trump ultimately is not really motivated to go down the sanctions route either. So all of this persuasion, all of this whispering, all of these coalition of the willing meetings that have been taking place in Paris and in other places, ultimately it's not going to lead anywhere. You can try, but it won't work. The United States isn't going to fight Russia in Ukraine, and the sanctions weapon has been used and it is exhausted and it has failed. I spoke about Lavrov's interview and he was talking about this too. Again, he fell just short of crowing, but he said that all of those people in the West who had said back in February 2022 that they were going to collapse the Russian economy, look at them now. Russia today is the biggest economy on a purchasing power parity level basis in Europe. It is the fourth biggest economy in the world. It is continuing to grow. Look at their economies instead. Germany, effectively now in recession or low-level recession for 3 years, with the situation there deteriorating. Britain and France teetering on the brink of government collapse and financial crisis. The United States also overextended. And if you want to try sanctions, they didn't succeed. They're not going to succeed again. And the Americans know this. They know that they can't win against China in an economic war. They've just experienced a debacle with India. Gideon Rachman is right. They're not going to fight the Russians in Ukraine. They're not going to go down the road of the kind of economic war the Europeans are talking about. So all of these ideas, all this effort, all this energy, all of this time to try to get the Americans to do these things, it's all ultimately for nothing. But Gideon Rachman says you need a plan B. What is that plan B? He doesn't, of course, suggest one. He is an arch hawk on Ukraine. He has been the most committed supporter, one of the most committed supporters to Ukraine, writing in the British media, and that is saying something. But if the Europeans cannot win against Russia in Ukraine, if their sanctions by themselves can't work, and Friedrich Merz, by the way, as I discussed in a program I did a couple of days ago, has admitted that the European sanctions cannot by themselves force the Russians to capitulate. If the Europeans lack the military means to take on the Russians, which everybody basically agrees that they do, then there is no plan B that the Europeans have that can enable them to succeed against the Russians in Ukraine. They can't pressure the Russians economically. They can't help the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians militarily. So what can that plan B be? Well, I'm going to suggest what it is. Talk to the Russians. Do what I have been talking about, well, since 2022. Do what others have been saying as well. Lord Skidelsky, for example, who has given one brilliant and courageous speech basically advocating that very thing in the British House of Lords, where he's heard to in silence. Everybody shuts their ears and won't listen. Talk to the Russians. See whether you can come up with some kind of arrangement which, even if it cannot preserve Western positions in Ukraine, can at least deliver long-term security in Europe. That, it seems to me, is a realistic plan B. There is no other. Now, I've been saying this for a while. Gideon Rachman, it seems to me, is probably still a step away from admitting to this obvious truth. But to repeat again, what other alternative is there? The idea of doing deplorable things like attacking Venezuela, overthrowing its government, quite plausibly creating chaos there, and assuming that that will somehow rescue the situation. That's not going to help. It's going to make matters worse. Remember, by the way, how back in 2002, people were saying, the advocates of the Iraq war were saying that, don't worry, all the problems about the cost of the Iraq war, it'll all repay itself. We'll go into Iraq, we'll gain control of their oil, and we will make a profit on the whole enterprise. Well, it certainly turned out otherwise. About that, no one can doubt. Well, maybe Venezuela will be different. It's a very different country from Iraq, I accept. But how can one be sure? And put aside the fact that intervening in that kind of way in Latin America for the United States and the Western powers is going to provoke a massively negative reaction in Latin America, which could throw up a whole new set of problems. Overthrowing the Maduro government in Venezuela doesn't solve anything. It makes the problems worse, if that is the plan. So, given that you have no realistic plan B, your sanctions aren't going to succeed because the Chinese and the Indians and the others have said they're going to continue to buy the Russian oil. Everything that you've tried in military terms has been unsuccessful. Also, you haven't been able to get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire, and you've now admitted that that won't happen. And all your attempts to isolate Russia have been unsuccessful. Well, go for the real plan B. It isn't a betrayal of Ukraine. Betraying Ukraine is to continue along this current path, which is leading eventually to the destruction of Ukraine. General Gerasimov has been seen with a map showing Odessa and Nikolaev as part of Russia. Do you really want to wait until that outcome is achieved before you take steps, if that's what you want to prevent in the West? Maybe it is. I don't know. But it does seem to me a very strange thing. So you're not helping Ukraine. You're betraying Ukraine by leading them further down that primrose path that John Mearsheimer spoke about all those years ago. Negotiate. Go to Moscow. If Zelensky won't go to Moscow, send somebody else who will. It can't be Macron. The Russians can't stand him. It obviously can't be Kaja Kallas, who is a fool. It can't be Keir Starmer, who the Russians don't take seriously and who is in deep crisis as well. In fact, I have some private information, which I'm not going to discuss in this programme, which reveals how deep the crisis of the Labour government actually in Britain really is. But there are plenty of people in Europe you can send. You could send someone from Italy, for example, maybe the Italian foreign minister, who seems a much more level-headed man, or better still, the Italian defense minister, even more so. Or you can send other European politicians who've historically had good relations with the Russians. Pierre Fillon in France, or dare I say it, Gerhard Schröder in Germany, or someone like that. You can send them to Moscow. And maybe something, even now, can be saved. But of course, they're not going to do any of that. They're going to carry on. They're going to continue their meetings. They're going to speak about sanctions and tariffs. Trump will continue to give his deadlines and make his threats, which he will then retract. And in the meantime, the Russians will advance. Maybe they will launch that big offensive. Maybe they will take steps against the Dnieper bridges. And what then? Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various programs, platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. More from me soon. Have a good day.